Joining me now is Congressman Bob Good. He serves on the House Budget Committee, House Committee on Education and Workforce, and as a member of the House Freedom Caucus, he represents the 5th Congressional District of Virginia. Congressman Good, welcome back to the program.
Afternoon, Tony. Good to be with you.
I know you're busy. Very fluid situation on Capitol Hill. As we just laid out a few moments ago, a rule vote, procedural vote, then potentially moving toward 4 appropriations bills. Is that where we stand right now?
Yes, we'll have one rule tonight for all 4 bills, but then we'll vote all 4 bills individually. We're going to have hundreds of amendments for all 4 bills. I think it's nearly 500 amendments, which is how regular order is supposed to work, where we get to make changes or suggest changes to the bills before we have to vote up or down. Sadly and unfortunately, Tony, this should have happened months ago. We knew when September 30 was on the calendar. The Speaker committed that we would pass our 12 individual appropriation bills, the first Congress to do that in some 20 years, and that we would do it at the pre-COVID spending levels for non-defense discretionary. Because of his unwillingness to drive that commitment, to lead the conference, to cast the vision, you've had some stops and starts and back and forth, and we haven't done that as we should have. And so we now find ourselves up against a deadline.
But this is progress. The fact that you're going to have these amendment votes on the floor, that's something we haven't seen in a long, long time.
It is late progress that was unnecessary on the calendar.
Right. I understand that.
However, to get 4 of them passed this week, which would bring us to 5 total, would be some progress. We ought to be able to complete this work by mid-October at the latest, with minimal impact on the country from a shutdown standpoint.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The timing of it is inexcusable that we're down here to the wire at the last moment. But this, the fact that you're having floor amendments on an appropriations bill is a part of the negotiations that took place back in January to allow for these open rules. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. That was forced on the Speaker in the negotiations back in January. We would not have had a return to regular order if we hadn't had the Speaker battle that we did from the 20 members who challenged that. And so it's been a reluctant change, but the change is in place. But we shouldn't be up on the deadline to September 30. We shouldn't be here now 4 days out doing it. But it is progress.
Agreed with that. But sometimes progress comes painfully. So let's talk about, is there a way forward? Do we see consensus beginning to build?
Well, I will also add, Tony, that we are actually, we've agreed to cut our spending this year by $64 billion by what we're passing out of the House. That's an embarrassing low, modest objective, but at least it's historic because Congress never cut spending. Right. We've got a $2 trillion deficit. So $64 billion is not nothing, but it is a small amount with that amount of deficit. And we finally got the Speaker to agree to that last week. And then, I think we can get that done the first week or two in October with minimal impact on the 15% of the government that is considered non-essential, that doesn't stay open when there's a pause at that level. I have said, Tony, that I would support a CR, a continuing resolution, a short-term funding bill that secured the border and cut even further for the month of October, that went to the agreed-upon levels from April and that the Speaker agreed to back in January instead of the compromise levels. That's $115 billion annual savings, or about $10 billion on a monthly savings, that I would agree to that as long as we're moving our spending bills. But I'm not sure the votes are there to that effect.
So how many votes do you think you're short of arriving at consensus on that?
Well, I think we might be short as many as close to 10 on that. But what I fear will happen, Tony, is that moderate and liberal Republicans in the House and the Senate will join with Democrats and pass an unconditional CR, or even more than the 30 days. As a matter of fact, the Speaker is now beginning to back off on the spending levels and back off on the timeline and talking about a 45-day spending level, a continuing resolution instead of 30 days. And he's not talking about going back to the pre-COVID levels for that was agreed to this just Wednesday night when we had our last conference meeting. So, we need consistency. We need the Speaker to leave. We need him to challenge the moderates who support him for Speaker to support him in this, so we can send the strongest bill possible to the Senate, which gives us a stronger leverage position in negotiations.
We're up against a break here. Congressman Good, can you stick around for just a couple more minutes, because I got a couple more questions for you on this. At some point, the conservatives have to realize, look, I've got the best deal I can get. Let's go with it. I mean, do you think you can bring your colleagues along to that point?
Well, the main thing is to get the spending bills done. And again, it's the Speaker's fault that we haven't done that before the end of September 30. So to have to take a week or two in October to do it, we don't want to relieve the pressure of the moment and the deadline. And then we go from a 30-day to a 45-day to a 60-day, and it doesn't cut spending. That's the history, Tony.
Right.
And so my colleagues are concerned about us repeating that. We don't need a Republican majority to do that.
A part of the continuing resolution discussion is to attach to that provisions that the Republicans had put forward on the border, protecting the border. We were talking about this yesterday, mentioned at the top of the program. The situation at the southern border is simply out of control. In August, according to the Customs and Border Protection, 232,000 migrants came across the border in August, a record for the calendar year, and an increase of more than 25% over July. Now, what is contained within these provisions that would be attached to a temporary government funding bill, and why are they needed? Sticking around with us, Congressman Bob Good of Virginia. All right, Bob. Let me just ask you this: I think this is needed. I mean, we're seeing the media is actually starting to finally report the crisis at the border. What are the provisions that would be attached to any kind of temporary funding bill in terms of addressing the border situation?
To your point, Tony, that these blue cities in New York and so forth, these blue states are starting to suffer greater consequence because of the border, and so now you're having a more difficult time for the mainstream media to fail to cover or to try to cover up for the Biden border failure. This is intentional on his part, and what the provisions would be is H.R. 2, our border security bill, which would complete the wall. It would reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy, which means those with asylum claims have to wait in Mexico for their case to be heard, 90% of which are fraudulent, of course. And, if Mexico knows they're going to have to keep these illegal aliens in their country until their asylum claim is heard, then Mexico all of a sudden gets serious about their own southern border rather than holding these individuals in their country. And folks learn that the jig is up and they stop coming in the mass numbers. It also reinstates a detain or return policy, meaning individuals have to be detained at the border or return to their home country. There's no more catch and release into the interior of the country at taxpayer expense. So those kind of basic provisions that we're working on the Trump administration would be included in the continuing resolution that I have agreed to and that Speaker McCarthy at least spoke to back Wednesday night when we had our last conference meeting.
Those are not theoretical policy provisions. They actually worked during the Trump administration. So it's and we've seen this escalation of border crossings and crime. And I do think you're absolutely right. What has brought this before the legacy media are the blue state and blue city mayors that are screaming. I find it a little comical. These sanctuary cities are screaming now that people actually took them up on their virtue signaling of being sanctuary cities.
To your point, it was theoretical before, and now it's reality. And they're getting just a little taste of what the border states and border communities are suffering under. And their own citizens are rising up and saying, you can't continue to do this. You're not taking care of our own citizens in need, legal Americans who are here, obviously, and our citizens. And yet we're going to be spending $150 billion a year currently on our immigration, our illegal immigration to this country, with no end in sight by this administration.
So those provisions, they get onto a temporary funding bill, 30 days, also cuts spending, as you talked about. Does the Democrat-controlled Senate and the White House agree to it, or did they shut down government over it?
Well, great question. But the House is responsible, as you know, for what we do. And that's why we should pass the strongest funding bill. We should have passed the amount that we agreed to back in January and in April that all Republicans voted for to strengthen our negotiating hand and end with the border security here, because that anything that comes back from the Senate is going to be worse. They're not going to try to make anything better. They want to spend more money. The Senate Democrats don't want to secure the border, of course. And then you end up into a conference committee where you negotiate something that, maybe we can vote for, maybe we cannot. What's the best we can do? So you've got to have a good bill to start with, good policy to start with. You got to be strong and resolved in your negotiating skills. And for once, let's have Republicans win in the negotiations instead of Democrats, as always happens.
I agree. You should never go into the negotiations waving a white flag, which is what historically Republicans...
Or passing what we think the Democrats in the Senate and the White House will agree to. That would be terrible if we do that out of the House.
Agree 100%. Congressman Bob Good, always great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today and for fighting for those conservative principles on Capitol Hill.
Thank you, Tony. Great to be with you.